the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
But the judgments he makes about animals, he can't reconcile them to his theodicy. But this is also a Lewis of the tender heart.
Yeah.
This is the Lewis who says, my neighbors trap their mice in their homes, but I feed mine.
Yeah.
Well, my guess is that Lewis's pets will be in heaven and Jerry's
Oh, is
won't
that?
be in heaven.
Okay. All right. That's
how
good
I
to know.
summarize.
Hello, this is Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my fellow co-director at the Wade Center, David C. Downing, and Aaron Hill, our podcast producer, and the wonderful Jerry Root, to continue our conversation about C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain. It's one of the shorter books that we have discussed by Lewis, and yet led to one of the more complex conversations we have had. So we are really excited that you can join us, as we could never fully complete everything that could be said about this text, but can explore it more thoroughly.
So we're so glad that we can extend your pain.
Can we talk about the chapter on hell?
Yeah.
Not that I enjoy talking about hell, but Lewis talks about it a lot in a lot of his books, and I was wondering if we could talk about it, and then maybe if it's different than what he says elsewhere, or anything. I wanted to read a quote here, and then you guys just take it away. It says, "Finality must come sometime, and it does not require a very robust faith to believe that omniscience knows when." So there's this idea that there will have to be an end, and the end state will have to account for any remainder in the equation of good and evil, and so he tries to wrestle with that in this chapter. What do you guys think about what he says about hell here?
In the Pilgrim's Regress, he says evil is vociferous, like nuclear fission. It just keeps going and going and proliferating.
Mm-hmm.
He says hell is the tourniquet God places on evil.
Ooh.
You can go this far and no farther. He says that he thinks the gates of hell actually are locked from the inside.
Yeah.
People
Right.
are rebel from the end. And the book of Job in chapter 21 actually says that. It says, those going to Sheol say to God, depart from us. We do not even desire the knowledge of thy ways. So if God gives man free will and man chooses against God, you reap what you sow. You sow corn, you get corn. You sow wheat, you get wheat.
Yeah.
You sow self, you get solitude. And the last best gift God, a loving God, can give to people who will have him on no other terms is, I give you what you want. I give you a place of solitude away from me forever. And the irony is, it's not away from him. You get people all the time who say, I think hell's not flames, it's just separation from God. In what way can you be separated from the omnipresent? And in what way can you be separated in time from the eternal? And the answer is, it's a moral separation, not a space-time separation. I think God's present there. I think he's still extending grace by giving them hell even. But they are so blind. They are so hard-hearted, and they are so incorrigible that they've refused any grace in any way it's offered. And Lewis asks in one place, what do you want God to do for these people? Do you want him to extend to them forgiveness? Do you want him to open the gates of hell and say, come unto me? He says, but he's already done that in Christ.
Yeah.
If they refuse, what's he going to do?
Right.
He's going to give them a place.
Yeah.
It's an extension of grace in
And
some
that
senses.
is why he was right to put this chapter of hell after he established some foundation, because several things he's talked about before helps respond to people who say, I can't believe in a God who sends people to hell. And he says, first of all, hell doesn't operate according to an economy of exchange the way most religions. It's about what you do and you get either perdition or paradise. So he's eliminated that argument. And
That's
he
a
says,
good point, Crystal.
think of this bad man's perdition not as a sentence imposed on him, but as the mere fact of being what he is. And that goes to what that great line you just quoted, Jerry, that everyone, that hell is locked from the inside, and people who are in hell choose to be there.
Yeah.
It's not just, okay, this is my retribution, neener. And then also
Neener.
this idea of temporality, where people say, I can't believe that just, for the rest of their, for eternity, for years and decades and centuries, people are suffering. Well, you've got to stop thinking according to our temporal views of things. God is outside of time. Heaven and hell are outside of time. The other thing he said, and he had said this before, is we have to release our dependence on traditional images, just as quantum physics, and he had said this earlier in the book, it's impossible to really give you good pictures of quantum physics. And so what we have to depend on are inadequate pictures. Like when I was a child and they were trying to explain an atom, it looked like a planetary system. You know, you have the nucleus and then the electrons and protons going around it. And today they said that is a bad image, but it's impossible to really understand this.
Yeah.
So also our images of hell, whether it's burning fire or, as in Dante, frozen ice. Those are just metaphors. The important thing is that this is separation from God, and people choose it. God does not give it to them in retribution. Okay, David.
Well, I wanted to go to Great Divorce, where George MacDonald says, in the end, there are two kinds of people.
Yes.
Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done.
I love that.
You mentioned Dante. He has a phrase, he calls the Inferno the Hospitio Doloroso, which means the sad hospice, the sad asylum. This is the last thing God could do for them, is to put them in this place. I had a person once who said, when I was in Sunday school, a teacher told me that I was going to hell, and I've never gone back to Sunday school since. And I told my brother about it, and he said, well, you should have said, yeah, you probably are going to hell. So, you may be in hell right now because you're so separated from God.
You chose it.
Well, it is interesting because Lewis seems to understand the idea of eternal incorrigibility. So the scriptures are constantly extending grace. I read through the Bible year after year after year, and I keep seeing it. The sinning society gets the prophets, which means God hasn't given up on them. And you have this one passage in Matthew 23 where Jesus is talking about the woes. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. And many of them are pretentiousness and so on. They're self-referential. They're at risk of cultivating that eternal incorrigibility, and they're warned against it. And finally, he says in the last woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, who build your shrines to the prophets, testifying the fact that it was your parents who killed the prophets. Who's going to save you from the wrath of hell? The next verse, therefore I will continue to send you prophets. And then it's followed up with, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you stone the prophets and kill those who are sent to you. How I wanted to gather you under my wings like a hen gathers its chicks, but you would not let me. There is the love of God still pursuing people who are hardening their heart, and God is speaking at them, and everybody has these warnings in this life, and we're better to attend to them so that we would understand the outreach of the loving God rather than hardening our heart and experiencing the consequence of our sin.
Right.
I love that statement when Lewis says we are not nouns, we are merely adjectives, and this idea that we want to be I am I. He actually quotes that from Shakespeare's Richard III, ultimate selfishness. And what I love about that is when God delivers God's own name to Moses in the burning bush, he says, I am that I am. God is a verb. God is constantly working in this way that you just recounted, Jerry. And what strikes me is that many Christians, including me growing up, treat faith as a noun rather than a verb. That if we are walking with God, we are becoming more Christ-like. There is, from one degree of glory to another, versus a lot of people see faith as this noun. Okay, I got faith. It's all taken care of. I'm going to heaven. It's like, here's my faith. This is my ticket going to heaven. I got it all done. But that is as selfish as seeing yourself only as a noun.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Lewis's friend, Sister Penelope, wrote a book on the Old Testament, and she was a Hebrew scholar. And she said the I am that I am, the part of the Hebrew means persisting. The book is called God Persists because she felt that God was saying, who are you? I'm the one who persists. it was an interesting take on the Hebrew grammar that his very nature is the one who is always there. He's always persistent.
Yeah.
He's never.
I was going to say he sets up the stakes that lead to the hell chapter very well at the end of the divine goodness chapter when he says that, he's gone through this whole long explanation of why the world is designed the way it is. And he says, we are bidden to put on Christ to become like God. That is, whether we like it or not, what God intends to give us what we need, not what we think we want. And then he goes on to say that that's essentially all that God can give us. He can only give us what he has to give. And then he quotes George MacDonald there. And then he says, to be God, to be like God, and to share in his goodness and creaturely response, or to be miserable. These are the only three alternatives. If we will not learn to eat the food that the universe grows, then the only food that we can ever grow, then we must starve eternally. And so he sets the stage. He essentially says, this is the world that God has created. It has a set of rules, and he can only give us what he can give us, and what he's trying to give us is himself. And if we won't have him, then what do you get? You get not him, you get suffering. And he sort of puts the onus on you throughout the book of you can follow us down this road and embrace Christianity, and then you get the problem of pain and evil. But you have to make a decision. It's sort of a choose your own adventure apologetics book, so that by the time you get to the hell chapter, you're no longer saying, why does God send people to hell? You've put yourself in the situation where you go, well, I guess I have to choose.
God doesn't send anybody to
I'm
hell.
going to interpret things. Do I want to become more like him? Do I want him, or do I not want him? In which case I get, this place where,
That's where the pain, the eternal pain is, I think, too. I think Augustine was right when he said, our hearts are restless till they find their rest in thee.
Yeah.
And that the pain of hell is an eternal restlessness. Having turned our back to him, we end up having what Pascal didn't call it a God-shaped vacuum. Actually, he called it a God-shaped abyss. It can't be filled by any created thing, but only by God himself. And we're stuck with the hole forever. Yeah. We've got the eternal longing and the groping with no hope of finding satisfaction because we've turned our back on the one who alone can satisfy.
Well, I get a lot of my wisdom from C.S. Lewis and a lot of it from bumper stickers. There used to be a bumper sticker that said, if God seems distant, guess who moved?
Yeah.
I always thought that was a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But Lewis also says something pretty shocking about pain being part of heaven. He says, there may be something not all unlike pains in heaven. God grant us soon to taste them. It echoes something he had said. That's in his chapter on heaven. But earlier in the book, he was suggesting that when we go to heaven, that we will remember the ways we rebelled against God. We will remember our sin, and that will pain us. But the joy of being saved from our sins will overwhelm the pains of remembering them. Now, I have never heard anyone talk this way, but I kind of like it insofar as just as people are simplistic about hell, little devils with pitchforks and, burning fires. They're simplistic about heaven as just, this eternal bliss and little angels floating around that know, as Lewis does in The Great Divorce, we will be our fullest human selves in heaven. We will be more solid, which means that we will recognize, look at all those ways that I followed my own yearnings rather than seeking God. I can't believe I did that, but yay! Look at all I have been forgiven.
Who was your second grade teacher, Crystal? What was his or her name?
Miss Biggs.
Who was your best friend in second grade?
Probably Priscilla Williamson.
Can you remember one topic you studied in school in second grade?
Sure.
Telling time.
Well, I can't remember.
Well, here's
not
my
one
point.
topic.
When was the last time you thought about second grade?
Oh, like 30 seconds ago.
But I mean, before that.
She got you there, Jerry.
Before I asked you the questions.
Oh, my goodness. 40 years ago.
I think when we get to heaven, this life is going to be like second grade. We'll be able to recall it, and our clarity of recall will be better because it won't be in any way obstructed by our sin and self-interest. But nevertheless, I think that the overwhelming riches of a developing understanding of the eternal graces of God and his presence and wonder will be such that if we do reflect on these things, it'll be so nominal and so minor compared to the glory that is to come.
Exactly. Exactly.
And Lewis always portrays heaven
But they'll be
as
there.
dynamic. You're always in the foothills climbing into higher and higher mountains. He doesn't make it static. You're just sitting around.
But there's also a sense in which, if you totally forgot all those things, you would cease to be yourself.
Exactly.
You'd be a different person. And so you have to remember them in some way. Not like you're going to sit there and replay them in your mind and be like, oh, I remember that time I sinned and did this. That was so great. You know, your feelings towards them are definitely going to be different. But, I mean, your conversion experience is tied up with your own regrets and repentance.
That's right.
To think that we would lose our memory of our conversion experience, this formative event that actually eventually led us to the foothills, to being in God's presence, seems kind of a naive way to think about it. Like we're going to be up there playing harps going like, well, where was I born? I don't remember.
You aren't even human that way.
Yeah, you know?
And that's the way, if you see images of heaven in the New Yorker, it's like all these people have little wings. In other words, you aren't human anymore.
Yeah.
And, but God endorses in our humanness. And I think that's why Paul emphasized in 1 Corinthians 15, if I remember correctly, the resurrection of the body, that God endorses flesh. God took on flesh.
New heaven and new earth.
Here is how he put it in the chapter, how C.S. Lewis put it in the chapter on human wickedness. And this anticipates that little bit that I just read. Lewis writes, it may be that salvation consists not in these in the canceling of these internal moments of remembering our lying and our deceit and self-interest, but in the perfected humility that bears the shame forever, rejoicing in the occasion which it furnished to God's compassion, and glad that it should be common knowledge to the universe. We will be glorying in God making possible our redemption.
Does anybody have any other quotes or thoughts from that heaven chapter?
We're talking about our favorite quotes right in the very beginning of the book. I want to get this into the podcast. He says, when pain is to be borne, a little courage helps more than much knowledge, a little human sympathy more than much courage, and the least tincture of the love of God more than all. I thought that was just a wonderful summation of this whole book in a way.
What stood out to me rereading this was in the chapter in heaven, he makes a big point that we'll still be ourselves and we'll still be different in heaven, that union isn't a dissolution of identity. We don't sort of blend into one giant mass like pantheism. And he says heaven is a city and a body because the blessed remain eternally different, a society because each has something to tell all the others. And so, he says if we all experience God in the same way and returned identical worship, then we would have no song to sing. There would be no symphony, no different parts.
Right.
And so I think that's a very positive picture of heaven, whereas sometimes in sermons and things where I've heard heaven talked about, it seems very much like, oh, we're going to be unified and we're all going to be one. And it feels very much like we all get the same uniform and then we, you know, it's sort of like our identity, something about us is, wiped away and we all think the same and act the same. And I like that picture of heaven that we're one, we're unified, but that's only possible if we're distinct and we're still different and still have something to tell each other that's unique.
But the distinction isn't necessarily set apart and defined by virtue of our fallenness or our sin.
Yeah.
It's more ontological than that. And Lewis writes about this, especially in the Arthurian Torso, where he picks up on the passage from Dante's De Monarchia, where he says function precedes essence, that God had a purpose for us before he ever created us with the essences, the uniquenesses that he gave us. And in creation account, he creates light on day 1, but he doesn't create the essences till day 4, the sun, moon, and stars. So he created purposes first. Those purposes are unique. They're assigned to us. They're the things that make the body of Christ work. If all were eyes, where would the hearing be? If all were hands, where would the feet be? But while we may play our parts in our sin, even Paul says at the beginning of the section on heaven, as Lewis quotes him, I reckon, said St. Paul, that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us. Yeah. It's a glory that's anticipated in God making us unique. But also, it's interesting to me that we're still living in the womb. We haven't been born to the life that we are meant to be a part of forever. So this is anticipatory. It's not the essence of what will be.
All creation groans in anticipation.
Yeah.
I love the line in this book where Lewis says, heaven was not created for us. We were created for heaven. It's a wonderful way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I at my age, I think about it fairly frequently. I don't make 5-year plans anymore. and I'm looking forward to it. And I remember if I never had sex till I got married, and I thought about it all the time. I think about heaven now like I thought about sex back then. If heaven's all it's cracked up to be, I just can't wait. And I am excited about it. And I think that that's the way our hearts should be. Whereas you've got a lot of people who never get to the place where they're meditating about heaven because they're so worried about the moment of death. That death is just a door. Like Narnia, he's got it pretty clear. They pass through the door and they're in at Narnia in heaven.
So this is a great discussion. We probably could keep talking about heaven forever. But what are your you like that, Jerry? What are y'all's concluding thoughts as you we've all read this book countless times. I was going through and seeing all the pages I've earmarked and underlined myself as I was rereading it. What are your thoughts? What did you take away from it this last time as we wrap up?
Lewis is a clear thinker, and again, before he judges, he defines and he describes. And he describes in such a way that the reader can enter into his train of thought and have their own train of thought, I think, benefited.
Yeah.
But the one thing I've noticed as I read this book over and over again, like you said too, and it's amazing to me how many of the ideas in this book continue to reverberate throughout the rest of his writing.
Yes.
So you can find these ideas repeated.
Yeah.
And I think that this helps us also see in Lewis a model of a faith-integrated approach to life. Christianity isn't a compartment of his life. It's the life. His faith is the thing that breathes life into all of his thinking.
Yeah.
And I think that comes through in the book.
Yeah, it is very much like a Lewis theology in a nutshell book almost. It's really good.
But it also shows us his flaws. The judgments he makes about Calvin, I think, are significant, but the judgments he makes about animals, he can't reconcile them to his theodicy. But this is also a Lewis of the tender heart.
Yeah.
This is the Lewis who says, my neighbors trap their mice in their homes, but I feed mine.
Yeah.
And he writes about vivisection, because he doesn't want people to experiment with animals.
We need to have you come back and talk about Lewis and animal suffering, because I feel like this doesn't reconcile with some of the stuff that he has in the Chronicles of Narnia and in the Ransom trilogy as well, where they're sort of raising up the animals and eventually they'll start to talk, and doesn't seem to line up there, but we'll save that for another discussion.
Right.
I'd love to talk about that.
Well, my guess is that Lewis's pets will be in heaven and Jerry's
is
won't
that?
be in heaven.
Okay, all right.
That's
good
how I
to know.
summarize.
Okay.
Mine are already there. They're just wondering if I'm going to get there.
Well, what are y'all's concluding?
Wait, I want to say something about animals.
Oh, okay.
Because I was reading this book for the first time. I had never read it before. While we were celebrating Thanksgiving with some relatives, one of whom is an animal trainer.
Oh.
And she exemplified exactly what Lewis was talking about. Lewis actually says an animal is most natural when it's the most tamed. And I have been someone who basically I'm scared of animals. I never had pets growing up except goldfish and, They died.
You couldn't teach them to bark and roll over and fetch.
Exactly.
It was tough.
And so I express fear anytime I get around a dog. I find they're annoying. They're yapping. They're sniffing your crotch. Very annoying. But my niece had so well trained her dog that it turned into this loving companion. And for the first time in my life, and I'm old, the first time in my life, I had a dog sitting on my lap for 20 minutes that I was just petting, and it would just look up at me with its beautiful eyes. And there was a type of love, but she had disciplined the love into that dog. And she talked about the only way you get a loving pet is if you discipline them. And it was exactly what C.S. Lewis was talking about here as an analogy that pain and, discipline for a pet, you maybe smack it with a magazine or you withhold its treat and it turns into this loving companion. I was experiencing what Lewis was saying, but I agree with you, Jerry, that he got so enamored of that as a metaphor, he kind of turned it into an absolute of our pets being in heaven.
Well, the one thing that would be interesting would be to read that letter that Underhill wrote to him. So Charles Williams, edited the Evelyn Underhill letters, and there's 2 letters she writes to him. And when he gets his first one from her, he says, "Receiving a letter from you is the greatest literary experience of my life." And he refers to it a second time when he gets a second one. But she's the one that takes issue with him because she thinks that an animal, when it's fully alive, will be consistent with its unique animal nature, which will not necessarily be what we've cultivated in it. So I'm not saying that Lewis is right or Underhill's right, but it would be interesting to engage that debate.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of work with the Humane Society US, reading papers on Lewis and publishing papers with them because of the vivisection thing. All of his evil characters in his fiction are cruel to animals.
Yeah.
And they, Uncle Andrew's blowing up guinea pigs before he then is cruel to Polly and Diggory.
Right.
Yeah.
And you've got the nice who's doing experiments on animals. Animals finally rebel against him and set things right. But they start with experiments on animals and then they try and kill people. You've
Weston
got
and
Weston.
Perelandra is dissecting
you guys
frogs.
are-
Vivisecting these things.
This is all supposed to go in the Animal Suffering podcast.
We can do it. We can revisit it.
All right,
We
we'll
will
come
do
back.
fine.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So let's get back to the concluding thoughts.
I don't
David, what are your
think our
concluding
niece
thoughts?
subscribes to smacking animals. By the way, I think it was all.
I was going to say, yeah.
But she sacrifices her own interests. Like she knew when that pet had to go outside, so she had to leave the conversation, go out into the freezing cold, and because she knew it was best for the animal.
Well, you do also train by ignoring.
But-
Actually, that's one of the things.
But actually, look what that did to your friend. Your friend ends up cultivating a tenderness towards the animal. Something comes out that's magnanimous towards the animal. And I think that that's also glorious in its way.
Yeah.
Mm.
All right. So concluding thoughts.
I liked the idea that it's not just about the problem of pain. Anyone who has an affirmative philosophy of a benevolent God is going to have to deal with evil and suffering.
Gotcha.
But Lewis says, well, other people have a problem of good. When you say, I'm not a Christian because there's so much injustice and suffering in the world, you say, well, by what standard are you measuring God?
Yeah.
Lewis has an essay where he says, I couldn't believe that in God because he seemed to be such a brute and blackguard to make such an imperfect world. But then he said, well, where did I get this standard by which I judged him to be a brute and a blackguard?
Yeah.
So I like that idea that everybody has a set of questions to be answered. And if you say, I don't believe in any affirmative philosophy or Christian faith, you have your own set of unanswered questions. So ultimately, it's a matter of which set of questions are you willing to grapple with. It's not a matter of Christians have a lot of things they have to explain and non-Christians have nothing to explain.
Yeah.
So I really like that idea that if you don't have a problem of evil, then you have a problem of good.
Yeah, definitely. He definitely sets that up in the book. You don't have to believe this, but if you want to reject these answers, then you've got to embrace something else. At least be consistent about your choices.
The transcendence of good breaking through even the evil that we suffer is something we can't prevent or avoid. For example, I'll say to people, think of the worst thing that ever happened to you. And they get it in their mind. I say, you don't have to share it. Just log it in. Now think of the next worst thing. Now think of the next worst thing. Now think of the next worst thing. And I've never had anybody get to more than 10 things. You start asking it, and when you're repeating this, they start laughing because they can't think of any more bad things. Then I think, well, now think of the good things that have happened to you. And that second list goes on and on and on. So that the bad that we've suffered are errant brushstrokes across a massive canvas of good. And then I say, okay, go back and revisit the bad things. And I say, did you ever, given time, see any good come out of some of those bad things? Given time. 100% of them say, yeah. Maybe it wasn't resolved, but they grew in empathy towards other people who suffered. They gained some wisdom from it or something like that. I said, if good came from some of them, given time, you have good reason to believe maybe good could come from all of it, given eternity. But you have no good reason to ever say no good could ever come from any bad you're experiencing in a moment, because your own experience counts against that judgment. Now, if we get somebody who makes that claim, no good could ever come from this, we're going to give them great patience and tenderness because they're suffering, and we want to be concerned about that. But the bottom line is the good keeps coming through. You cannot suppress it. God is good. His creation's going to reflect it, and eternity will reverberate it forever.
Crystal, any concluding thoughts?
Well, that is related to the dominant theme that I see in the problem of pain, and that is the idea that true love is sacrificial. And we have that modeled in Jesus Christ, but it also challenges, and Lewis explicitly challenges something that I see is a definite problem these days, where people reduce Christian love to being nice. You got to be nice to people. He uses repeatedly the word kindness.
Yeah, kindness.
That is the easy way out, just being kind. And I was thinking about this several months ago when I was responding to someone's writing project, and I spent hours and hours. I mean, I sacrificed my time to try to help them make it better. And I said, this introduction doesn't work. You need to consider this. You can do this. And I figured that was an act of love. And the person just responded, well, you weren't very kind. And I see that in some professors who will just give easy grades on a paper because they don't want to spend the time. They don't want to sacrifice time that they could spend on their own scholarship. I especially saw this when I was teaching at secular universities. It's much easier just to be kind and give an A than really get in there and spend hours and hours to grapple with something. So that is this idea of putting the other above ourselves as the ultimate love, then not only is about us, but is about God creating us to be totally free human beings, giving us the choice to choose reconciliation with our Creator or go our own way.
Yeah.
And that causes God pain when we choose ourselves over loving Him.
Yeah.
When you mentioned this case of this woman, you put out so much time for her, and she said you weren't being very kind. At that moment, it seems to me she was using the word kindness as a synonym for condoning.
Yes.
You weren't condoning. Right. And the other thing too about heaven, the sacrifice of Christ will be behind us. I think we will still be honoring the Lamb that was slain forever and ever. But the one thing that's interesting is, while there will be no need to sacrifice the way Christ sacrificed to set right our sin problem, there will still be the high courtesy of heaven in glory, and the high courtesy as I offer my life for you. There will be these acts of courtesy that we will continue to demonstrate. I think, isn't it Charles Williams that talks about the high courtesy of heaven as my life for you?
Yeah. So we'll still be demonstrating love
Yeah.
by thinking of the other.
The other. Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
He says in the Divine Goodness chapter, he said, you ask for a loving God and you have one. But then he goes on to say that because he loves you, he's going to labor to try and make you better,
Right.
and to restore you to himself. And that inevitably is going to involve some suffering and, the need
Exactly.
to self-surrender. So there's a sense in which he kind of says, in sometimes you suffer because God does love you. Why am I suffering? If God loves me, why is he letting me suffer? And his answer is, well, it may be because he loves you that you're going through what you want, because he wants to bring you back to him, so.
You see that in human terms. You see a parent who spoils the child throws a tantrum, and they say, okay, you can have it.
Right.
And they're being kind in that they're avoiding
Yeah.
scene or negative emotions in the child. But that child is never going to be happy as an adult because they're so used to being indulged.
Yeah.
They haven't gotten disciplined. They haven't learned to rein in their impulses and their desires. So if you see that even in human terms, you wonder how much we want to be God's spoiled children, and he has something else in mind for us than that.
He wants to make us lovable.
Right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for letting me. You guys are great. I
Really
love
enjoyed
you
the
guys.
conversation.
I pray for you.
Thank you.
I'm grateful.
Thank you.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.